Most people are taught a comforting myth early in life. That strength is something you display. That boundaries are something you declare. That respect comes from asserting yourself clearly enough, firmly enough, loudly enough. This belief is seductive because it offers control. If something goes wrong, you assume you simply failed to express yourself properly. You explained too little. You tolerated too much. You didn't draw the line clearly enough. So you compensate. You clarify. You justify. You defend your position before it is even challenged. From the outside, this looks like maturity. From the inside, it slowly erodes something essential. Carl Jung observed that in the first half of life, the psyche is oriented outward. Adaptation is rewarded. Approval becomes currency. Identity is negotiated rather than inhabited. You learn to read the room. You sense what is expected. You unconsciously offer access to your emotional field in exchange for belonging. At work, this looks like being reliable, available, endlessly reasonable. In relationships, it appears as empathy without limits, understanding without containment. You participate deeply in the emotional atmosphere around you. Jung called this state participation mystique, a condition in which the boundaries between self and other remain porous, undefined, unconsciously shared. At this stage, you don't feel weak. You feel engaged. You feel alive in response to others. But there is a cost. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. The psyche starts to register an imbalance between output and return. Energy flows outward, but very little comes back transformed. You may notice it as exhaustion that rest does not fix, as irritation that feels disproportionate, as a growing resistance to explaining yourself one more time. Nothing dramatic breaks. Nothing collapses. Instead, a quiet pressure builds. This is the beginning of a shift most people misinterpret. They think they are becoming colder, more distant, less tolerant. But Jung would say something else is occurring. The psyche is preparing to withdraw permission, not permission in a social sense, but permission at the level of unconscious access. And once that withdrawal begins, the world starts to feel different. The uncomfortable truth is this: much of what we call influence from others only works because the psyche allows it. Pressure requires participation. Manipulation requires access. Emotional extraction requires openness without containment. In early adulthood, this openness feels necessary. You are still forming an internal center of gravity, so the psyche borrows orientation from the environment. You absorb moods. You anticipate reactions. You adjust before you are asked to. This is not pathology. It is developmental. But when this pattern extends too far into midlife, it becomes unsustainable. Jung noted that the psyche has its own regulatory intelligence. When a structure no longer serves individuation, it begins to dissolve. This dissolution often feels like disillusionment. You stop feeling impressed by authority. Compliments lose their charge. Criticism lands, but doesn't penetrate. At first, this is confusing. You may try to recover the old responsiveness. You wonder why you no longer care as intensely. This is where many people panic. They mistake the withdrawal of unconscious permission for emotional numbness. They attempt to force empathy back online. But what is actually happening is reorganization. The psyche is shifting its reference point inward. Instead of asking, "How am I being perceived?" it begins asking, "What am I consenting to internally?" This is a profound change. Consent moves from the surface to the structure, from behavior to boundary, from reaction to orientation. Externally, very little appears to change. You still show up, you still speak, you still engage, but internally, the emotional contract has been rewritten. You no longer offer access automatically. You no longer over-explain, not because you are withholding, but because there is nothing to prove. Others may sense this before they can articulate it. They feel less able to pull you into urgency, less able to extract reassurance, less able to provoke reaction, not because you resist them, but because the door they were using no longer exists. This is the silent boundary, and once it forms, it cannot be undone by effort or will. Every psychological shift has an origin point, not a single event, but an accumulation. Often it begins with over-responsibility. You carried more than was yours. You mediated conflicts you did not create. You explained yourself to people who were not listening. At some point, the psyche recognizes a pattern. Energy is being spent without individuation. Jung warned that when consciousness remains too long in adaptation, the unconscious compensates. What you ignore consciously returns as tension, fatigue, or withdrawal. This is why the shift often follows a rupture, a betrayal that clarifies reality, a burnout that forces stillness, a loss that strips away performance. Externally, it looks like life interruption. Internally, it is correction. The psyche stops negotiating. It stops seeking validation. It stops asking permission to exist as it is. This is not a dramatic rebellion. There is no declaration, no confrontation. The most striking feature of this phase is silence. You notice you no longer rush to fill space. You allow misunderstandings to stand. You stop correcting narratives about you. This is deeply unsettling to people who relied on your accessibility. They may interpret it as distance, coldness, withdrawal of care. But internally, something else is true. For the first time, the psyche is conserving energy for integration rather than distribution. You begin to sense where your responsibility ends, not intellectually, somatically. There is a felt boundary now, a quiet no that does not need explanation. Jung would recognize this as the beginning of individuation proper, the point where the ego stops serving the environment and begins serving the self. Not selfishness, alignment. And alignment changes how force operates around you, because force requires leverage, and leverage requires unconscious consent. Once consent is withdrawn, pressure collapses under its own weight. As this boundary stabilizes, a new pattern emerges. You are no longer reactive, but you are not detached. You are no longer available, but you are not closed. This is a subtle distinction most people never learn to see. Your presence becomes economical. You speak when there is something to say. You listen without absorbing. Emotional signals still register, but they no longer reorganize you. At work, this looks like clarity without urgency. In relationships, it appears as warmth without self-erasure. People may test this change unconsciously. They repeat old behaviors. They escalate tone. They attempt to re-engage the old contract. But nothing happens, not because you resist, because there is nothing to hook into. Jung described this stage as the ego's subordination to a deeper organizing center. The self no longer negotiates with the environment. It relates. This is why the shift cannot be imitated. It is not a technique. It is the byproduct of psychological maturation. Those who try to simulate it through coldness or withdrawal create tension. Those who embody it create stillness. Stillness is often mistaken for weakness until others realize it does not move. This is the paradox of sovereignty. It does not announce itself. It does not defend itself. It simply exists. And because it exists internally first, the external world adapts to it naturally. Less friction, fewer power struggles, cleaner endings. Not because you control outcomes, but because you no longer participate in dynamics that require control. What emerges on the other side of this shift is not invulnerability. You still feel, you still care, you still engage, but you are no longer available for unconscious contracts. This is what it means to become psychologically untouchable, not unreachable, not superior, but sovereign. Your inner world is no longer organized around response. It is organized around orientation. Jung believed the second half of life demanded this reversal. Energy returns inward. Meaning replaces approval. Depth replaces speed. Those who resist this shift remain externally successful, but internally exhausted. Those who accept it often appear quieter, less driven, and strangely unmovable. They are no longer negotiating their existence. They have withdrawn permission. And in doing so, they reclaim something essential, their psychic energy. This is not a state you achieve. It is a structure you grow into. And once it forms, it does not need protection, because nothing enters without consent.